So for our webinar, we're going to be watching a presentation, and once it's completed, there will be a short break where we will show you some information for next month's event. Once we have that event information on the screen, after that, we're having a question and answer session. And you can put your questions either on YouTube or Facebook. There are people ready to comment to add your question to the chat. If you want to have your camera on, let those people know that you would like to sign your comment. If you would like to speak your comment, please also let the moderators know in the YouTube or Facebook rooms, and they will let us know that you would like to make a comment. And if you have questions with this topic tonight, those are the questions that we'll be open to. If the questions are not relevant to the presentation, we will ask you to stop disrupting the presentation or just not accept your question. So before we move on, let me introduce our guest, Dr. Marla Hatrak. And her topic for this evening is Onward to Positive Collaboration in California. Welcome, Marla. How are you this evening? Good, good. Thank you, Kavita. Thank you for that nice introduction. You know, I really feel so funny sitting here at home giving this presentation. Often I sit at home with my own drink and watch a presentation, but today I'm the presenter, so no, I need to be on my game. I also was practicing for my presentation yesterday, thinking about how I was going to work out interaction with the audience and questions with the audience, and I had the realization that there is no interaction in this presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and go through my PowerPoint, and then at the end, I'm going to leave 30 minutes for more of an open discussion and questions and answers. Okay, so I guess I'm going to get started. So the topic of this presentation, Onward to Positive Collaboration in California. So why are we here tonight? This is our webinar. This is the webinar series that we are all participating in. We had the EHDI Symposium on January 11th, 2020, which is, wow, over 2 years ago. At that symposium at Ohlone College, there were published proceedings from the symposium, which you can then also see on the California Association of the Deaf website if you want a copy of the report. I realized too, and this is right before COVID hit, right before we went to the point where we couldn't have face-to-face meetings anymore. Of course, hopefully, we're hoping to host it again this fall, a new symposium. So we'll keep an eye out for that. Next slide. Oh, that's right. This is the first of 9 webinars in the California Association for the Deaf webinar series. And it's going to be held on the fourth Thursday of every month. The next webinar will be on March 24th. And on that date, the presentation will be given by David Longo, and his topic will be Whole Child Development, the Fight for LRE. Next slide, please. Some of you may be aware, maybe some of this might be some new for some of you. So I am choosing to start my presentation with looking back at some history of the AB 2072. And there was a lot of important events historically before that point of 2010. But when I became part of the history of AB 2072 was in 2010. So So at that time, there was a group of oral deaf individuals who supported an oral method and the use of only spoken English. And when deaf advocates found out, we had to fight and push back against AB 2072. It was deaf people from the deaf community, hearing allies, friends, family. But who really was the front runner and who was making the decisions and driving the bus? It was deaf people. And specifically, it was Sherry Farhanha, who was working with many people. And I was one of the people who had the opportunity to work with Sherry to in this fight against AB 2072. And in 20, again, I want to say for AB 2072 was vetoed by Governor Schwarzenegger, which was a big sigh of relief throughout the deaf community because it was not a beneficial law for the community. Now, in 2012, there was a symposium of about 30 deaf organizations, so representatives from 30 deaf organizations, and who met for 2 days in 2012 to discuss what to do as a result of AB 2072. We were able to defeat this bill, but what did we want to do proactively as our next legislative measure? And from that meeting with 30 representatives, there was lots of discussion, and we were able to narrow it down by vote through the three main goals of what we wanted to address with our legislative efforts. We wanted a bill with interpreting, a bill that would impact K through 12 education, and of course, a bill that would impact ages 0 to 5 language acquisition for deaf children. So, of those three topics, and again, this was an emotional discussion, and we felt that all of these topics were extremely important, of course. But in the course of these discussions, we realized that yes, there are issues and things that need to be resolved with interpreting services and within K through 12 education. But we could continue to try to solve and spend money and fight for these type of issues. But in that third issue of language acquisition, if children were continuing to suffer from language deprivation syndrome, then the fight for interpreting K through 12 education would be fruitless. So the focus, was put on to ages 0 to 5 language acquisition. And at the ending of that symposium with that 30 different organizations, we had some different names, which had a beautiful history up to that point. But we decided from that symposium that we would create a group name of Language Equity and Acquisition for Deaf Kids, Language Equity and Acquisition for Deaf Kids, which is abbreviated to LEAD K. So with the LEAD K organization, we had Julie Rem-Samario as our president, and it was decided that we needed to have a language policy report, and that was the road to kindergarten readiness. That publication is also on the CAD website. It was published in 2017. And there was also a hearing ally named Laura Peterson, who were co-editors with me on the publication. And in 2019, there was a deaf coach training curriculum and services that was implemented in NorCal. There was funds that were received to develop a new deaf coach training curriculum. That is a curriculum to train deaf coaches to then work with families and using ASL. And in 2019, the California Association for the Deaf started the EHDI, EHDI, and Deaf Education Annual Symposium. And that was to include families, teachers, and members of the deaf community. In 2020, in the midst of COVID, NorCal again applied for funds for LEAD K family services and was able to establish a new program. So the point of this timeline and the history that I'm sharing with everybody here since 2010 is to show that these are quite important milestones that have been led by deaf people, by our deaf leaders, by the California Association for the Deaf, and leaders that we work with. And so I want you to remember who has been on the front lines and putting in the work to make sure these things are happening in the state of California. So how involved are deaf people in EHDI, EHDI? Are deaf people stakeholders in EHDI? And this is just a really short thing that I'm sharing from my dissertation. I don't know if you noticed when Kavita mentioned, but I'm newly Dr. Hatrak because I just got my PhD 2 weeks ago. But when I was working on my PowerPoint, I, had to type in those letters, PhD, and I thought, wow, that's real. It is an accomplishment. I'm able to put PhD on there now. And I just want you to know, anybody who's listening who's thinking about going back to school and furthering their education or getting a PhD, I'm here to be your cheerleader. And I'm willing to talk to you about that anytime. So if you're curious, please reach out. But how are deaf people involved with EHDI? Are we considered stakeholders? So first, let's start by addressing who is NAEYC. And that stands for the National Association of the Education of Young Children. And that is an organization that's 6 million members strong. It was established in 1922. So it is a very a very strong organization that has a lot of history. It's a nonprofit association that represents early childhood teachers, of course, paraeducators. So a paraeducator meaning like a teacher's aide, the educators who work with teachers, center directors, trainers. So those are the people who are in universities training students who then become teachers and early childhood teachers. Also the college educators, families, of course, families, policymakers, and advocates. Huh. There is a role for the advocates. Who are advocating for deaf children age 0 to 5? We, as the deaf community, as members of the deaf communities, we have been advocating for English, for ASL and English bilingual education, for recognizing ASL as a valid and viable language and an accessible language. So this is an important group that we represent. Deaf people should be considering themselves an important part of EHDI. In the Code of Ethical Conduct and Statement of Commitment, there's a lot of things that are enumerated: program standards, policies, but I picked out a few that were relevant to today's presentation. And that is the 4 ideals and principles that I want to highlight. First, the NAEYC believes that those 8 groups that I highlighted on the previous slide have an ethical responsibility to children. They have an ethical responsibility to families. They have an ethical responsibility to their colleagues, their coworkers. They're making sure that they're ensuring a good and safe work environment. And their 4th being the ethical responsibilities to community and society. Again, community. We as community members, we as deaf community members, we are relevant to these 4 ideals and principles. So it's really important to shift our paradigm as deaf individuals to be invested in early language acquisition for deaf children. This historic organization that I'm highlighting shows that we as deaf individuals should be and have a role. So I wanted to point out a principle specifically. Again, there are pages and pages of principles and ideals, but this is one that I wanted that I thought would apply to here today. If you can see here on the screen, when policies are enacted for purposes that do not benefit children, we have a collective responsibility. Remember those eight stakeholders that were mentioned. We have a responsibility, a collective responsibility to work to change these policies. Wow. Wow. So this principle shows us we should be trying to push for change and for policy change for deaf children. So now, why are we still concerned? 70% of babies and toddlers are language delayed or language deprived. 70%. Wow. That's a CDE.gov statistic. 8% deaf and 15% of hard of hearing K through 12 students read at grade level. That was published in O'Connell 2009 and Taylor 2016. 8% and 15%. So we remained concerns about the same concerns that have always plagued deaf students and in deaf education. We really want to change the landscape for age 0 to 5 deaf children. Why is this happening? Why? How can we, the reasons are aplenty, but in summary, first, we know autism is a factor. Humphreys published in 1977 in his dissertation. So again, we're referencing something that we've known since 1977 and 2022 as being a huge factor. Meadows in 1980, Meadows was a linguistics researcher, excuse me. And the basic deprivation of deafness is not the deprivation of sound, but is the deprivation of language, he's quoted as saying in 1980. So over 40 years ago. And then we're seeing a newer term, ableism, that I think is becoming more prevalent and more well known. And autism is obviously more specifically targeted to a deaf individual in the belief that a person who can speak or hear is superior to a person who cannot speak or hear. But ableism has a lot of similar applications, but it is a more mainstream term that applies to different abilities of all types. Lack of ineffective access to language deprivation syndrome. Gulati in 2014, 2016, and 2019 makes the argument for language deprivation syndrome. And the issue of medicalization. Maudlin wrote a book in 2015, a very wonderful book that I recommend everybody read, that really focuses on the medicalization of deaf children. The language policy report that I mentioned on the slide, that's also on the CAD website, spells out clearly that hearing technologies are not a panacea for language development. Sorry, they're just not. So now, the system itself, Eddie. So this is just a little bit from my dissertation that I wanted to point out. I realize now that, that's a hard slide to see. I don't know what that might look like for you on the live stream audience, but from the law that is passed to the implementation at state level, at the top on the graphic, you see the policy that the law is passed. It was passed in 2000, amended in 2010, and then passed again in 2017. And now it's actually up for reauthorization in this year of 2022. So then you see that there are the implementers who are responsible for the law being implemented. The Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level is responsible for that. But then you'll notice that beneath that, it is a three-prong split. There's the centers that are responsible for collecting data. the Center for the Disease Control. Their website has so much information, so much statistics, nothing about language. You see in the second box, oh my goodness, I'm even having a hard time reading it. What's wrong with me? Oh, right. Uh, HRSA. That's who's responsible for for disseminating the funds from state to states and other implementers. And then the third box, you see at the NIH, National Institute of Health. And more specifically, there's the Department of Communication Disorders that is responsible for research as far as hearing, cochlear implants, hearing aids, language acquisition. They are responsible for that. And then if you look beneath that, it continues to further be broken down into different agencies. This is the non-federal agency, the NCHAM, the National Center for Hearing Assessment and Management. And then you'll also see Hands and Voices, Language and Literacy Center, FL3 is how that's often abbreviated. And then the third state level implementer, you see Lead K Family Services, and also hospitals that do hearing assessments and audiology exams. So this hierarchy, this organizational chart is what you see here. Do you know how many of these boxes represent deaf individuals, deaf allies, deaf consultants, deaf stakeholders? Only one box. Only the box that says Lead K Family Services has a deaf principal investigator. And then also you have Teresa Arnold, who is the manager of the program Lead K, who is also deaf. So it is a strongly deaf-run ASL or a supporting organization, but it is the only part of the whole picture that shows that representation. So I took some verbatim text from the Yeti policy and just to show in our presentation exactly what does it say. So when a baby is screened, they are screened for appropriate educational, audiological, medical, and communication, and in parentheses, or language acquisition interventions. To design, maintain, and improve data collection systems related to newborn, infant, and young child hearing screening evaluations, and parenthetically, including audiological, medical, and language acquisition evaluations, diagnosis, and intervention services, which offer programs specifically designed to meet the unique language and communication needs of deaf and hard of hearing children. Provided comprehensive, consumer-oriented information about the full range of family support, training, information services, and language acquisition in oral and visual modalities. These are just a few quotes that I picked out from the policy just to get a sense of what the law really says. So keep that in mind. So part of my dissertation was to do a word frequency count and a policy analysis. So I chose the words hearing, language, and speech. And there were not very many mentions of language versus hearing. So I was curious to see really what the difference was. So let's look at it on screen. I see again, oh man, it's a little small. Darn it. But the policy, again, I think it's 3 pages in length. So it's a wordy law. And we see the word hearing appears 27 times as opposed to language, which only shows up 5 times. So clearly one can ascertain that the focus is on hearing and not on language acquisition. about any sort of discussion of promoting or acquiring natural language. And then I went to one of the intermediaries. I think most of us are familiar with uh, NCHAM, NCHAM. They again have a long history. Oh, yeah, thank you. They were established in 2009 and have been strong advocates of developing the EDI policy. And they are really ringleaders for the educational system's policies. And as I said, this is not a federal agency. This is a private agency. It's based in the state of Utah, or Utah State University, which is a private. It's a private research group that's based in the university, and I do believe it's a nonprofit as well. And their mission is to ensure that all infants and young children with hearing loss are identified as early as possible and have access to timely and appropriate audiological, educational, medical intervention, and family support services. I think one has to ask, which it might actually, let's see the next slide. Okay, no, wait, go back. I want before we go back. So when we're looking at this, deaf children are expected to get educational benefits without language. Show me how. How? It just seems to me that the focus on audiological education and medical intervention all miss the boat on language acquisition. So NCHAM is different than other organizations. They are responsible for supporting the state level and also for hosting the EDI conference. I believe it's the first week of March in Columbus, Ohio this year. So on their website, this is the graphic, this chart showing who they serve. Child and Family Medical Home. Again, no mention of language. So we see birthing hospital, audiology, medical specialists, policymakers, early intervention programs, early childhood programs, state EDI programs, advocacy support groups. There might be that one spot where deaf people are allowed to have a role. So as deaf community members, we're dealing with all these other stakeholders. So it's a call to action for us as deaf community members to put ourselves in the front, to take over the driver's seat, to let them know that we have vital information about how to ensure that deaf children can acquire language. I feel like I should slow down. Okay. So NCHAM, verbatim text. So when an infant with a hearing loss receives timely and appropriate diagnostic and intervention services, they have positive speech, language, and listening outcomes. Wow. So do we have data to show? Where is the evidence for this quote positive speech, language, and listening outcomes? Where is it? There is no national data affirming the academic success of K through 12 deaf students. That was published by Hall and Dills in 2020. So what's going on? The word frequency count, I know, hopefully I have the numbers memorized because I know the slide's going to be hard to see, but when we look at the policy, I think it's 8 times that language is mentioned. And if you see the hearing, the frequency of the use of the word hearing in their text. I should also mention that I was surprised there were some other words on the screen: audiological, health, intervention. Those all are also words that are mentioned more often than language in all of the word frequency counts in the implementer organizations. My interpreter's doing okay. I'm signing so fast. Okay, so looking at the California EDI system, Lead K Family Services gets funding from the HRSA at the federal level and is responsible for, so when a baby is identified as deaf, the name is then referred to school district and programs, and that's not exactly relevant to the discussion here, but the point is that at that point, the responsibility is for the hospital to refer the deaf baby and parents to organizations and programs. The verbatim text from Lead K Family Services, the website, and really all the texts that I'm referencing is from the organization's websites. So we see statements such as all deaf and hard of hearing children can acquire language. The tone, the attitude that portrays, the mindset, the positivity, hearing problems, hearing deficits, this negative mindset. This is such a different framing, such a positive framing. You can have language without having speech. You do not have to have speech to have language. That's just such a great message. This grant, again, this is the verbatim text from Lead K Family Services. This grant will support its newborn hearing screening program to address the early language acquisition of deaf children. I mean, this is so explicit. To me, it's the most explicit language acquisition for deaf children. There are mentions of it in other policies, but once or twice, as opposed to this huge emphasis on hearing and this overshadowing of focus on hearing. Whereas Lead K Family Services really shows through their text what their emphasis is. Receive early receive early intervention and support services that ensure age appropriate language development. I mean, my heart melts at these statements. Focusing on understanding development and early language acquisition. I don't think there's anything more to say. But again, this was written and developed by deaf people in California. Sherry Farina, Teresa Arnold, to name a few. I mean, our Kavita, our current president, was a part of this wonderful team. So deaf leaders developed this rhetoric. And then the word frequency count for Lead K Family Services. Let's see what the graph shows. It's not perfect, but it's pretty even, which is nice to see. And the last four words are all much less. There's no mention of medical. It's instead of being overly focused on any one medical or hearing intervention, it's a much more even representation in the word frequency count. So what do the implementers and the organizations that are part of the Yeti system think about? And what comments do they have about their experience? If you remember the FL3, Family Leadership and Language and Literacy Center, they have one tab that is specific about their four, I'm holding a lot of information in my head. I might be a little overloaded, but I was pretty sure there was four. And one of the four links that you can click on of an outline goal to increase family engagement and leadership and strengthen family support in the EDI systems of care in order to enable families to optimize the language, literacy, and social emotional development of their children who are deaf and hard of hearing. I think that's very nicely worded. But then it gets lost in the mess of really understanding what a deaf child needs is language acquisition. I do give them credit for the type of wording they're using and their goals. First few years of a child's life are considered a critical period for developing language. But this doesn't differentiate between spoken language and sign language and the need to have an accessible language. It just leaves it neutral and up to the family to decide. What does language really mean for a deaf child? And I think what's more even remarkable is having to do with the involvement of deaf adults. There was a big emphasis on deaf adults serving as members of boards, advisory committees, and quality improvement projects, specifically in the policies of FL3. So, noting that it's important to have deaf community members as involved, and also having adults who are deaf and hard of hearing represented in print materials, articles, and videos. Having deaf adults serve as expert presenters for webinars, conferences, and workshops. Adults who are deaf and hard of hearing developing policy guidance guidelines. Policy guideline documents. Wow, I was pretty impressed by having this being called out as being relevant, but completely not in practice. I don't see this being practiced. So the FL3 has 28 members of their on their center advisory board. How many of them are deaf? I mean, you can guess. I know I can't ask you for audience participation, but go ahead and guess. One is deaf. And the deaf person does speak ASL as their primary language. So we have one representation. There are 12 staff members. 2 of them are deaf or hard of hearing, but they do not use ASL as their primary language. Program directors, I was able to interview 2 program directors in Northern California just to see their opinions on deaf adults and community members' importance in a program. If you remember, the NAEYC mentioned that the community members were important. They were considered an important stakeholder out of the 8 groups of people that were highlighted. And so now when in the interview with program directors in early childhood centers, when asked what would improve deaf children's kindergarten readiness, their answers were as follows: family and community engagement. I was a little surprised when I was interviewing, to be honest, and they were saying deaf community engagement was really important. I mean, the things they said were beautiful. It's exactly what we needed to hear, but it's in putting it into practice that needs improvement. Talking about having a deaf play group after school. Saying sign language. Okay. Deaf storytelling. Deaf adults being involved in the program. Deaf-friendly play groups every day for social emotional wellness or language acquisition. But this leaves me scratching my head a little bit. Because, let me be honest, I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think that there is a 0 to 5 age deaf childhood program that does these things. So they were saying in the interview that these program directors, were quoted as saying deaf children need their affinity group. They need peer role models. They need deaf role models. And it feels like they're taking the words right out of my mouth. That's what we've been pushing for. So the words are there. We just need to ensure they're put into practice. Having deaf adults as coaches and models in our program makes the biggest positive impact on our families. Meeting and interacting with a deaf adult that communicates using sign language makes a difference. It's not as scary anymore. Parents think, oh, it's cool. He's deaf. He's successful. He's a doctor or whatever profession it may be. Why is language essential? We have to really go back to the basics and focus on language. It develops our brain architecture. It's the basis of cognitive development, socio-emotional development, the ability to communicate, to read, to be kindergarten ready, to read, to learn academics for the rest of the educational career. So that 0 to 5 language foundation. Why is ASL essential? Not spoken language. Why is spoken language not good enough? Why do we need ASL? It is 100% accessible as a language. Everyone can benefit from ASL. Everyone can learn. Hearing children, CODAs, SODAs, you name it. Everyone can learn ASL. Prevents language deprivation syndrome. Why? Because language deprivation syndrome is because of impoverished language input. So if a deaf child cannot hear, they cannot access language input, the language input becomes impoverished and leads to language deprivation. So what is language? We're talking about language. We have to remember that language is a social understanding. It's shared rules, shared meaning. So it's within communications with people. We learn how to use words, how to put words together, how to make new words, how to figure out what a word use, how to use the best combination of words. So this complex concept of language, being able to do all of these things. Oh my goodness, I'm over time. Dr. Lantos was published in 2014. Deaf children need to learn language. They must learn it from parents, teachers, and their community. The more language they learn, the better these children will be able to communicate. Deaf children, notice it says languages. If they want to learn 1, 2, 3, ASL, English, other languages, it's great. They can do that. So ultimately, the EDI system, which we saw in that graphic, all those organizations, the entire frequency count shows 535 times the use of the word hearing with 145 times the use of the word language. Meaning again, that hearing appears 72% of the time and language appears 20% of the time. With the other words you see on the screen being mentioned, the remaining percentage. But this clearly shows that the focus and the emphasis of EDI's policy is on hearing and not language. Alexander Graham Bell himself in 1884 was quoted saying, "I admit the ease with which a deaf child acquires sign language and its perfect adaptability for the purpose of developing its mind." Alexander Graham Bell wrote this in 1884. For just some concluding remarks for my presentation today, Humphreys coined the term autism in 1977. NorCal and CAD leaders of deaf involvement in EDI are crucial. The NAEYC has asserted that deaf community members are stakeholders and are crucial in their role. FL3 also points out that deaf adults are essentials. Program directors emphasize that deaf adults are essential to their programs. So, okay, there's a pattern. Let's put it into practice. And in closing today, I love this quote from Frederick Douglass. And I think it's a great quote as a Black man here as we celebrate Black History Month. It is easier to build strong children than to repair broken men. So now in conclusion, we want to go onward to positive EDI collaboration in California. Thank you. Thank you so much for your attention. If you have questions, I'm here. You can always, we have time for questions and answers, obviously, this evening. We're here till 7. But if for some reason you have a question you're not able to ask me, please email me at langpolicy@cad1906.org. Okay, I think we're ready for questions if there are any. What's next? Oh, wow. I need to check in with my interpreter if my interpreter's okay. Yeah, interpreter said she's going. We're good. We're good. We just want to check in with her because I couldn't see her while I was presenting. Please, I just first let me start, Marla, by saying thank you for your presentation today. Wow, I think it's fascinating. I think covering some of the history, but really talking about how to onward to positive collaboration. I think that's fantastic. So we have some questions that we are going to have addressed, and I think the fourth is going to be signed by somebody who wants to ask the question. But the first two questions, if you could just sign them, what you see on the screen. The first one, how can we let parents know what we have available in terms of language acquisition without implying that they must change how their children acquire language? It's really tricky. I think it's a tricky question. I used to take a class that was specifically in language acquisition. Long story short, I learned that when a family has a baby who is blind, for instance, they tell the family, you need to be mindful of how you speak with your baby who is blind. You have to use also what's called over or underhand, which means that you take the baby's hand and you do things with them under their hand, you show them things under the hand. If you're stirring, say you're baking something and you want them to know you're baking something, you're showing them you're baking something, you have the baby or child hold you with you while you stir and you talk. And they are telling families that that it's something simple like that. But we tell hearing families, well, you could have a cochlear implant, you can have hearing aid, you could do this, you could do that, you could do that. We're overwhelming them. Why aren't we just leading with language acquisition? Language acquisition would be sign or sign and speech. That's really the only things that families need to know and understand. There's a paper by Payne Tugis. She has a deaf son who's and a law professor at the university in DC. And she specifically called out the League K bill and applauded it as being a way to finally call out deaf children's needs versus hearing parents' wishes. The wish that their child may talk someday is not what the child needs. The child needs language to function. But how do we allow families to have this information? But I think my takeaway is we need to be more a part of it and more invested in the system so that we can make these kind of impacts. The FL3 organization that I mentioned, again, wholeheartedly supports deaf community members being part of their policy, but then I don't see them actually engaging with any deaf people in policy making. So I think that maybe the takeaway is just assert our rights to be involved and to be at the table. I think that is one best way. Hopefully that I answered that question well, because again, I will say it's tricky. Yeah, no, I do think that's a good question. Yeah. Okay, next question. I know there are few mentor programs that provide training to parents at home. Will we increase these number of programs all over California? And I'm not sure that I'm able to answer that question. Do I want to increase the number of these programs all over California? Of course I do. Of course that's what I want. But funding is always brought up as an issue. Staffing currently being a huge issue. Training deaf coaches. But I think, if in my opinion, that I hope to see that in the future. Maybe Sherry could help answer that question if she's here too. Okay, we ready for the next question? Okay, there it is. Is there some kind of curriculum that teachers can use that emphasizes language acquisition along with increasing reading comprehension? Is there a specific kind of curriculum that would be successful? Sad to say that language acquisition in and of itself has to be organic. There isn't a curriculum for language acquisition, which means that it happens within the home, it happens in the family. An example of that would be, an infant who was 1 or 2, that's a toddler that starts toddling around at lunchtime, or asking a toddler if they're hungry and maybe giving them options like, would you like a peanut butter jelly sandwich or a cold cut sandwich? That's language acquisition that's happening there. Reading books together at home, having the grandparents come and to chat about why the grandparents are here, or maybe then chatting about the new toy that grandma and grandpa brings. But these are all just natural things that happen in a home and in a household. And deaf children can benefit from regular curriculum once they have that language foundation. I think we've developed this idea that deaf children need some sort of special separate curriculum. And I'm not a big fan of that. I don't, of course, that's a completely different discussion from tonight. So we don't need to go down that road. But I think it is important that we realize that it's language acquisition that has to happen organically at home. And a lot of times, families will host a gathering and it's all this hearing family in the house. And it might be a deaf child having no idea that the language acquisition that happens naturally, that maybe the neighbor came over just to borrow sugar, but they miss so much from that direct language interaction and the access to language. They don't get the incidental learning. They don't see their mom coming home from work and their parents having a serious discussion and knowing what they're talking about. I remember watching my mom iron clothes and she was crying. And I said, Mom, why are you crying? And she said, Oh, me and dad just had a grown up argument, but it was something about money. Don't worry about it. But I knew exactly, I mean, I had access to that. And I knew that they had an argument and I knew how they resolved the argument. And, of course, growing up, the argument was always about money because we never had enough growing up. But, anyways, that's the important thing is this that we realize that this is a natural thing that happens at home and that we need families to know that, and when we're working with them as deaf coaches, to just try to sign at all times as much as possible. When you're at home, when you're at the table, they're saying that there's the new syndrome, dinner table syndrome. It's a lot of deaf community members and deaf adults knowing exactly what that means, knowing knowing the frustration of not wanting to spend holidays with your hearing family and hearing families being shocked, not realizing that they've done anything wrong and excluded their children for so many years. So really trying to minimize those toxic environments and the phenomenon. And I think it's the last question right before we finish. And Alexis, did you want to ask? Hi. Hi, Alexis. Uh-huh. Okay, sorry. I just wanted to make sure I was on the screen. Hi, thank you for letting me ask a question. And so I just so strongly agree that, children and their language acquisition is just so important. So I'm just wondering, I have three questions. First, I'm noticing as a young deaf person who experienced growing up and hearing family myself, it's often this focus on ASL and English, but there seems to be a stronger emphasis on ASL than English. I'm wondering how we can emphasize that we want parents to have access to both. I think that's a good question. Thank you. How do we emphasize that the choice of both? So if we look at families with deaf children and we're looking at deaf educators, you'll notice that they they are really good at navigating both worlds, being able to have ASL storytelling, for example, with a deaf educator, but also play with words in English. So being fully bilingual in both. So this makes me think of yesterday. I heard a bilingual office seminar at Gallaudet University yesterday. I was really impressed to see that they were really emphasizing bilingual education and being able to navigate and use ASL and English. And I think there's a lot of different examples for that, but I'll give you one. The first being that I know I have a friend, Melissa Herzig, and she did her teacher training, and she was developing ASL storytelling, I think, for fifth grade. I think it was fifth graders. And so they filmed themselves. And so they filmed it in ASL and then they edited it. I mean, it was a team of three students. So the emphasis being that you're required to edit your English just like you edit your ASL. So you have to edit your ASL production. So going back and looking at your ASL storytelling, making sure it's grammatically correct. And now that you have it grammatically correct in English or in ASL, now in text we want you to write down in English what you have in ASL. So I think schools are trying to emphasize the bilingual curriculum, and it's not always 50-50. That's not an organic natural way. Sometimes you're going to shift more to English, sometimes shift more to ASL, but I think that's a very good question, and I think that we're learning how to teach ASL and English, and really to value both. And I think that's happening too in families who use ASL and English. that they're really going to utilize both. Maybe you're going to read the news, you're going to read captioning when it's on the news and talk about what you read on the caption. Whereas at the dinner table, you're probably going to be able to maybe use your ASL and do some ASL classifier stories. So I think that that's something that's doable. Thank you. And I had another question. For those who are young and starting kindergarten and they don't have any exposure to deaf adults, language, or deaf identity, how can we provide them that that exposure in the state of California? Yes, yes, that's a great question. Um, Lead K Family Services is, I think, is doing, it's a beautiful project with deaf coaches. Families have to sign up for the deaf program through, or excuse me, the deaf coach program through their school district. And I think that's one of the best ways to make that connection and relationship with families. Another way, maybe I'm thinking about as deaf leaders is, for example, I live in San Diego. Maybe I would look for an early childhood program and volunteer my time and to be a part of it. Or maybe we could find funding to get deaf people to work in these centers. Um, Kindergarten readiness requires the work to be put in from ages 0 to 5. And I know for sure that if a student who enters kindergarten with some shaky language foundations can catch up, but it requires a lot of the right environment. And if you remember when I was mentioning the program director saying how crucial deaf leaders were and deaf adults, so maybe maybe we should be looking for big brother, big sister type volunteer situations, these school districts, or we should be encouraging these school districts. There's a lot of ideas, but man, it requires a program, it requires funding, it requires staffing. So it's sometimes having to think about how to make it work. But I think it's a good question. Okay, and then my third question, California has different programs in different regions, and it doesn't seem to be the same. Like they might be an ASL program versus a C program versus a SimCom program. Some locations don't have any regional program. Is how do we make that more standardized throughout the state? Oh, good question. I think that's a great question. How do we do that? I think we need to do first things first, second things second, then third, then fourth. You know what I mean? To me, first things first is that we have to make sure the deaf children have the language. We have to make sure we are affecting language acquisition before we can really address K through 12. I think the idea that programs maybe could be more standardized if deaf children had more access to language. And I think, going back to your second question, I want to mention that the Lead K Family Services is going to have a special event, Love and Literacy, on March 5th. This is a sponsored event that's through GLAD, DCS, NorCal, what other sister organization? DACARA, DHSC. So all are going to be hosting at the same time. So I think that is a great way to support our community and our families, that event. But thank you for your questions. Thank you. Appreciate it. Oh, goodness. Well, not to make excuses, but to, put it out on the table, We're all volunteers. Everything that you see the California Association for the Deaf doing, all the beautiful work, is all volunteer work. I mean, I wish if we could get some funding, I think we could combat financial power and influence more, which takes time to search for a grant. So usually we find ourselves just volunteering to engage. But I think it's a tough question. We are aware, we're very aware. I don't think there's enough recognition for all the beautiful work that has been done up to this point to combat. But I think with more allies, more deaf leaders being able to work together, that positive collaboration, we're really trying to encourage positive collaboration. I think that we can see things like this happening if with more positive collaboration. Maybe one day, right? One day. Is there another question, or is that I think we're or is that the last question? Oh, has there been a formal response from CAD? I think that must be a typo about the Utah Bye Bye program being shut down while quote leaving the LSL program in place. We did discuss doing a letter, an official letter, and yes, I think we should. I will admit to being caught up in the throes of my dissertation 2 weeks ago, as I just mentioned. And in my acknowledgments for my dissertation, I said I missed the most when I was focusing on academics, that I miss fundraising and hosting parties. So I want to come back to refocusing, letter writing, advocating, and making statements for things like this in these programs. Yes. I think that's the last one. Wow, wow. We've got a lot of work to do, right? Well, we see things like Utah, we got a lot of work left to do. So I think I'll say I look forward to working more with you, Marla. And I want to thank you for your amazing presentation this evening. If you're out there watching us, please make sure to reach out to your friends and families and community members about this very important topic. I want to thank also the behind the stage, the board of CAD who helped with the questions. I want to thank the interpreter whose voice you're hearing now, Jojo, who's voicing for Dr. Hatrak. We also have a captioner that's live captioning our stream today for you. And I also want to thank our vice president who is behind the scenes doing all the tech, Jermaine Cornish. So please look out for the next 8 in our webinar series. There will be 8 more presentations. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Hatrak. And don't forget to keep being present and being involved in your programs and services. Thank you. Thank you for being here, Dr. Hatrak. Oh, I appreciated it. Thank you. Hard to present without an audience. I hope somebody was out there. Not a lot of interaction, but I still enjoyed it. Better than nothing in this Zoom world. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening.